December 15, 1944. The frigid wind swept across the Detroit River as a convoy of olive-drab buses rolled through the gates of Fort Wayne, carrying 73 German soldiers who had crossed an ocean as enemies and arrived as prisoners. They pressed their faces against the frosted windows, watching the industrial skyline of Detroit emerge through the winter haze. Smokestacks rising like sentinels over a landscape they had been taught represented decadence and weakness. Most of them believed America was losing the conflict, that their capture was merely a temporary setback in an inevitable victory. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these men would witness in the coming days would shatter every assumption they carried across the Atlantic, transforming loyal soldiers into stunned witnesses of an industrial reality that made their homeland's war effort look like a craftsman's workshop facing a factory assembly line. Among the prisoners was Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, a decorated German Air Force pilot who had flown 62 missions over Britain before his aircraft was brought down over France. At 31 years old, Weber carried himself with the rigid confidence of a man who believed in his cause with absolute certainty. He had seen London burn, had dodged British fighters through cloud banks, and had returned to bases where mechanics worked through the night to repair battle damage with whatever materials they could scavenge. To Weber, this was what real commitment looked like. Soldiers and civilians united in sacrifice. Beside him sat Obergefreiter Hans Kruger, a tank commander from the Eastern Front who still carried the psychological scars of watching his unit's equipment break down faster than enemy action could destroy it. At 24, Kruger had learned to coax dying engines through one more engagement, to stretch fuel rations, to make spare parts from salvaged wreckage. He wore his resourcefulness like a badge of honor, proof that German ingenuity could overcome any material shortage. In the rear of the bus, Unteroffizier Otto Becker sat in silence. The submariner had survived the sinking of his vessel in the Atlantic, spending 18 hours in the freezing water before an American destroyer pulled him from the sea. At 27, Becker had witnessed the gradual strangulation of the submarine fleet as replacement vessels arrived less frequently and crews grew younger and less experienced. But he kept these observations to himself, unwilling to voice doubts that might be considered defeatist. The buses turned onto Michigan Avenue, and the city unfolded before them, even in winter. Even with the war effort consuming resources, Detroit hummed with a vitality that seemed impossible. Traffic filled the streets, cars moving in steady streams that suggested gasoline was plentiful rather than rationed. Storefronts displayed goods behind glass windows. Streetlights illuminated sidewalks where civilians walked without the haunted urgency that characterized German cities under bombardment. Weber watched a woman exit a shop carrying multiple packages, her coat fashionable rather than patched and repatched. A group of factory workers crossed at an intersection, their lunch pails suggesting regular meals rather than shrinking rations. He told himself this was a facade, that surely America was suffering the same privations as Europe, that their propaganda simply hid it better. The convoy passed through neighborhoods where houses stood intact, their windows whole, their yards neat despite the winter dormancy. No bomb craters interrupted the streets, no buildings stood gutted by fire. The absence of destruction felt surreal to men who had grown accustomed to landscapes pockmarked by war. Colonel James Harrison, the officer commanding the prisoner processing center, had received specific instructions from the War Department. The prisoners were to be treated in accordance with international conventions, but they were also to be given a thorough introduction to American industrial capacity. The orders came from the highest levels, based on the understanding that these men would eventually return to their homeland and the stories they told would matter. On their third day at Fort Wayne, Harrison addressed the assembled prisoners through an interpreter. His message was simple and direct. They would be taken on a supervised visit to the River Rouge complex, the Ford Motor Company facility that had converted to war production. They would observe the manufacturing processes. They would ask no questions about specific military applications. They would simply watch. Weber exchanged glances with Kruger, a propaganda tour, clearly. They would be shown some modest assembly operation and expected to be impressed. Both men had visited German factories, had seen the organized efficiency of European production. They anticipated a few machines, some workers, perhaps an attempt to make normal industrial output appear more impressive than it actually was. The morning of December 18th arrived cold and clear. The prisoners boarded buses again, this time with a heavy escort of military police. The journey took less than 30 minutes, following the river southwest to Dearborn. As they approached the complex, Becker, who had positioned himself by a window, felt his breath catch. The River Rouge plant stretched across the landscape like a mechanical city. Buildings the size of cathedrals stood in ordered rows, connected by rail lines and roadways. Smokestacks punctured the sky at intervals, their emissions evidence of fires that never went out. The sheer scale defied comprehension. Weber had seen photographs of German industrial facilities, had visited the Messerschmitt works. This was something else entirely, something that belonged to a different category of human endeavor. They entered through a security gate, where guards checked credentials with practiced efficiency. The buses drove past parking lots filled with thousands of civilian automobiles, evidence of a workforce so large it required its own internal transportation system. Weber tried to count the cars and lost track. In his entire city back home, there were perhaps a few hundred private vehicles remaining. Here they stretched in neat rows to the horizon. The tour began at the steel mill. They walked along an observation platform overlooking a floor the size of several football fields. Below them, molten metal flowed in glowing rivers, guided by workers who operated equipment with casual competence. The noise was tremendous, a symphony of industrial power that made conversation impossible without shouting. Their guide, a Ford supervisor named Robert Mitchell, spoke through the interpreter with obvious pride. The mill operated 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. It processed its own iron ore shipped directly from company-owned mines in Minnesota. The facility generated its own electricity, produced its own steel, manufactured its own tools. It was, Mitchell explained, almost entirely self-sufficient. Kruger watched a crane lift a ladle of molten steel and pour it into molds with precision. The speed of the operation struck him immediately. There was no waiting, no delays while workers prepared the next stage. Everything flowed in continuous motion, one process feeding seamlessly into the next. He had seen German foundries where casts cooled for hours before moving to the next station. Here, timing was measured in minutes. They moved to the engine assembly building, and the reality of American production struck with the force of a physical blow. The assembly lines stretched further than they could see, disappearing into the distance where the building's far wall became a blur. Aircraft engines moved along the line at regular intervals, each station adding components with choreographed precision. Mitchell consulted a clipboard and provided statistics. The plant was currently producing 1,000 engines per day. Not per week, not per month, per day. 14 different models, ranging from small 6-cylinder units to massive 18-cylinder radial engines for heavy bombers. Each engine was built to exact specifications, tested upon completion, and shipped to assembly plants within 48 hours of rolling off the line. Weber did the mathematics automatically. 1,000 engines per day meant 7,000 per week, 30,000 per month, 360,000 per year, from one facility. His mind rejected the numbers as impossible, but his eyes showed him the evidence. Engines moved past at a rate of more than 1 per minute. Workers added components with movements that had been refined to eliminate every wasted motion. A young worker, perhaps 19 years old, installed magnetos with speed that suggested extensive practice. He completed his task in less than 2 minutes, then moved to the next engine as it arrived at his station. Behind him, another worker added the next component, and another, and another. Each person performed one specific task, but the cumulative effect was an engine that progressed from bare block to completed unit in less than 8 hours. In Germany, Weber knew, a skilled mechanic might assemble an engine over several days, interrupted by material shortages and the need to work on multiple projects simultaneously. Here, specialization and continuous flow created output that multiplied individual productivity by factors that seemed impossible. They walked past a quality control station where every 10th engine was pulled from the line for complete disassembly and inspection. Mitchell explained that tolerances were measured in thousandths of an inch. Components that failed inspection were scrapped, not reworked. The cost of maintaining standards was simply accepted as the price of reliability. Becker, who had watched submarine engines fail at critical moments, understood the implications immediately. Reliability was not something you hoped for. It was something you engineered and tested and verified. It was expensive and wasteful and absolutely essential. The Americans had the resources to be wasteful in ways that ensured nothing failed when it mattered. The machine shop occupied another building, this one devoted to producing the specialized tools that the main assembly lines required. Automatic lathes cut metal to precise specifications, monitored by operators who intervened only when measurements deviated from acceptable ranges. One worker oversaw 6 machines, walking between them in a circuit, checking gauges and adjusting settings. Mitchell mentioned that the plant manufactured most of its own tooling, designing and producing custom equipment to optimize specific manufacturing processes. The machine shop employed 300 engineers, whose sole job was continuous improvement, finding ways to shave seconds from assembly times or reduce material waste by fractions of a percent. The cumulative effect of thousands of small efficiencies was a production system that operated with the precision of a watch. Weber watched a milling machine shape an engine block, metal shavings curling away in precise spirals. The block moved to the next station in exactly 6 minutes, positioned by automated guides that required no human adjustment. They ate lunch in a cafeteria that served 4,000 workers per shift. The prisoners were given the same meal as the regular workforce, a thick stew with meat and vegetables, fresh bread, coffee with real cream and sugar. Kruger ate slowly, savoring food that would have been considered luxurious back home. Around them, American workers chatted casually, discussing weekend plans and sports scores, with the ease of people who expected tomorrow to be much like today. One worker noticed them and nodded politely. No hostility, no particular interest, just acknowledgement that other human beings were sharing the space. The casual normalcy of the interaction struck Kruger as profoundly strange. These people were building the engines that powered the aircraft bombing his homeland, and they did it with the same attitude they might bring to making automobiles or refrigerators. The afternoon tour moved to the final assembly areas where complete aircraft took shape. They walked along a B-24 Liberator production line, watching as fuselages that arrived as separate components became complete bombers in a process that took 18 hours from start to finish. At peak production, Mitchell explained, the plant completed 1 aircraft every 63 minutes. Weber stopped walking. The interpreter repeated the figure, thinking perhaps it had been misunderstood. 63 minutes. 1 complete bomber, ready to fly every hour of every day. He calculated again. 24 aircraft per day, 168 per week, 720 per month, over 8,000 per year, from one factory, and this was one factory in one city. How many such facilities did America possess? How many were producing trucks, tanks, ships, ammunition? The scale was incomprehensible. Germany's entire aircraft production for a year might equal what this single facility produced in a month. A B-24 rolled off the line, its metal skin gleaming under the building's lights. Workers attached the final components, 4 massive engines that had traveled from the engine assembly building just hours before. A test pilot climbed aboard, started the engines, checked the instruments, and taxied toward the airfield. The entire process from empty line position to flying aircraft had taken less than a day. Becker watched the bomber disappear through the hangar doors and thought about the submarines he had served on. Each vessel took months to build, assembled by skilled craftsmen who cut and welded and fitted components with painstaking care. Here, mass production had reduced complexity to a series of standardized operations that could be performed by workers with relatively brief training. The implications were devastating. Germany was fighting an industrial war with artisan methods. Quality was high, individual craftsmanship was superb, but quantity was limited by the availability of skilled workers and specialized materials. America had built a system where quality was engineered into the process, and quantity was limited only by the number of factories you could build and workers you could hire. They visited the foundry where engine blocks were cast. Molten aluminum flowed into molds at a rate of 1 every 45 seconds. The molds themselves were precision instruments, designed to produce blocks that required minimal finishing. A German foundry might produce a dozen such blocks per day. This facility produced over 2,000. Mitchell led them to a viewing area overlooking the material handling system. Trains arrived at the plant carrying iron ore from Minnesota, rubber from plantations in South America, lumber from the Pacific Northwest. The raw materials traveled through the complex on a network of conveyors and rail lines, transformed at each stage, emerging as finished components that moved to assembly areas with computerized precision. The supervisor explained that the plant operated on a principle called vertical integration. Raw materials entered at one end, finished aircraft departed at the other. Everything between was controlled, optimized, measured, and continuously improved. The company employed specialists whose only job was to study material flow and eliminate bottlenecks. Weber had seen German factories struggle with material shortages, watching production lines halt, while workers waited for components that never arrived or arrived damaged by transportation problems. Here, the material flow was so reliable that inventory was measured in hours rather than weeks. Components arrived at assembly stations exactly when needed, reducing storage requirements and ensuring freshness of time-sensitive materials. The tour concluded at an observation deck overlooking the main campus. From this vantage point, they could see the entire complex spread before them. Smoke rose from dozens of stacks. Trains moved between buildings. Trucks traveled internal roads in constant motion. The parking lots had filled during their tour as the day shift arrived to replace the night crew. Mitchell provided final statistics, his tone matter-of-fact rather than boastful. The River Rouge complex employed 85,000 workers. It consumed more electricity per day than many small cities. It maintained its own fire department, police force, and medical facilities. It operated its own steel mill, glass plant, and rubber production facility. It was, in essence, a self-contained industrial nation dedicated to a single purpose. The prisoners stood in silence processing what they had witnessed. This was one facility, one city, one company among many, and it was producing war materials at a rate that made their own nation's efforts look insignificant by comparison. On the bus returning to Fort Wayne, conversation was muted. Weber sat staring at his hands, trying to reconcile what he had believed with what he had seen. He had been taught that Americans were soft, that they lacked the discipline and commitment necessary for industrial warfare. He had imagined them struggling with rationing, suffering under the weight of military production, sacrificing their comfort for the war effort. Instead, he had seen a country that had built industrial capacity so vast it could produce weapons of war, while its citizens ate meat for lunch and drove their own automobiles to work. The factory they had toured was operating at full capacity, and yet the city around it seemed prosperous rather than strained. Kruger broke the silence finally, speaking in German to the men around him. What they had witnessed was not normal, he said. This could not be typical. Surely they had been shown an exceptional facility, something built specifically to impress visitors. The others wanted to believe him, but the doubt in his voice undermined his words. Becker, who had remained quiet throughout the tour, finally spoke. He described the submarine pens in Germany, the careful husbanding of resources, the pride workers took in building each vessel to the highest standards. Then he described what he had seen today, the casual waste of scrapped components that failed quality checks, the abundance of materials, the assumption that there would always be more. The Americans, Becker said quietly, were fighting a different kind of war. Germany was fighting for survival, squeezing maximum efficiency from limited resources. America was fighting with surplus, accepting waste as the price of overwhelming volume. And in a contest between efficiency and abundance, abundance would eventually prevail through sheer mass. Back at Fort Wayne, the prisoners settled into the routine of captivity. They received mail from home, letters that described shortages and bombardment and growing uncertainty. They read between the lines, understanding what could not be written explicitly, recognizing the gap between official propaganda and private reality. Weber began keeping a journal, something he had never done during active service. He wrote about the factory tour in careful detail, describing the assembly lines and the statistics and the casual competence of American workers. He wrote knowing that these words might never be read, but needing to document what he had witnessed for his own understanding. Christmas arrived, and the prisoners received packages from the International Red Cross. The contents were generous: chocolates and cigarettes and small luxuries that many of them had not seen in years. The guards celebrated their own holiday with obvious abundance, and the contrast with conditions at home became impossible to ignore. In January, another group of prisoners arrived, recent captures from the Western Front. They brought news of the situation in Europe, describing the relentless advance of Allied forces equipped with seemingly unlimited supplies. Every position abandoned revealed American supply dumps filled with materials, fuel, ammunition, food in quantities that suggested the concept of shortage was unknown to the enemy. Weber spoke with a panzer officer who had fought in the Ardennes. The officer described watching American forces respond to the German offensive, not with careful conservation of resources, but with overwhelming material response. Artillery barrages that lasted for hours, consuming ammunition at rates that would exhaust a German unit's monthly allocation in a single day. Airstrikes that continued despite weather that grounded German aircraft. Replacement vehicles that arrived faster than they could be destroyed. The officer had watched his own unit's strength gradually erode, not from combat losses alone, but from mechanical failures that could not be repaired for lack of parts. Meanwhile, American units that suffered equivalent damage simply requisitioned replacement vehicles, which arrived within days. The prisoner described finding an abandoned American supply depot during the offensive. Expecting a treasure trove of scarce materials, they had instead found abundance that seemed wasteful. Crates of rations, each containing more food than a German soldier received in a week. Fuel drums stacked in pyramids. Ammunition boxes marked with production dates from just weeks before. Everything was fresh, new, produced in quantities that suggested the supply would never run out. The prisoners gradually formed a community united by shared understanding. They were not defeatist, not exactly, but they had seen something that changed their perspective fundamentally. They had believed in a narrative of German technical superiority and American material weakness. The reality was inverted in ways that made previous certainties impossible to maintain. In March, Weber was called for an interview with American intelligence officers. They asked about his service, his training, his observations of German industrial capacity. He answered honestly, seeing no reason to conceal information that was either already known or irrelevant to the current situation. He described the carefully organized production systems in Germany, the high quality of individual craftsmanship, the ingenious ways that shortages were overcome through improvisation. Then the officer asked what he thought of the River Rouge tour. Weber paused, choosing his words carefully. He said it had been educational. The officer smiled and asked him to elaborate. Weber explained that he had understood intellectually that America was large and productive, but understanding statistics and witnessing physical reality were different things. You could know that a factory produced 1,000 engines per day without truly comprehending what that meant, until you stood on the floor and watched them roll off the line with mechanical regularity. The officer nodded and asked one final question. Did Weber believe Germany could win the conflict? The pilot sat silent for a long moment, then answered with the precision of a man who had learned to measure reality against belief. He said that Germany possessed brave soldiers and skilled engineers, and a population committed to the cause. But courage and skill were not enough when facing an enemy that could replace every loss 10 times over, that could accept waste as a cost of doing business, that had built an industrial system so vast it operated as a force of nature rather than a human endeavor. Victory, Weber said, required either destroying that industrial capacity or outlasting it through attrition. The first was impossible, the second increasingly implausible. The mathematics were simple, brutal and undeniable. Spring arrived, bringing news of Allied advances on all fronts. The prisoners gardened in small plots assigned to them, growing vegetables to supplement their rations. They played football in the exercise yard. They attended classes taught by fellow prisoners, sharing knowledge of languages and skills. They waited. In May, the conflict in Europe ended. The news arrived via radio, broadcast in German so there could be no misunderstanding. Weber sat in the common room, listening to the announcement, feeling neither surprise nor despair. He had known the outcome since that December day at River Rouge, had understood the inevitable conclusion once he witnessed the gap between what Germany could produce and what America was producing. The repatriation process began slowly. Kruger was among the first to depart, shipped back to a homeland he had not seen in 3 years. He carried memories of assembly lines and parking lots filled with automobiles, images that would haunt him as he witnessed the destruction of German cities and the poverty of the immediate post-conflict years. Becker returned later, finding his family alive, but his city reduced to rubble. He took work in reconstruction, applying lessons learned from watching American industrial processes. Efficiency he preached to anyone who would listen, standardization, quality control. The future belonged to those who could combine German craftsmanship with American scale. Weber was among the last to leave, delayed by administrative processing. He finally sailed from New York in November 1946, standing at the ship's rail as the city receded behind him. The skyline remained intact, unmarked by conflict, its buildings standing as testimony to a nation that had fought a global war without experiencing battle on its own territory. He returned to a country that needed rebuilding, not just physically, but psychologically. The certainties of the previous decade had collapsed under the weight of defeat. People wanted explanations, understanding of how the conflict had been lost. Weber shared his experiences carefully, describing what he had witnessed without embellishment or propaganda. Some listeners accused him of exaggeration, unable to believe that such industrial capacity existed. Others nodded in recognition, having heard similar accounts from other returning prisoners. Gradually, understanding spread. Germany had lost not because its soldiers lacked courage or its engineers lacked skill, but because it had entered an industrial contest against an opponent operating at a different scale entirely. In the decades that followed, River Rouge became a symbol of American industrial might, featured in newsreels and documentaries and historical accounts. The facility continued operation, eventually transitioning back to civilian production, manufacturing automobiles for consumers who had delayed purchases during the conflict years. The prisoners who had toured the facility in December 1944 scattered across Germany, carrying memories that shaped their understanding of the post-conflict world. Some became industrialists, applying lessons learned from that single day to rebuilding German manufacturing. Others became teachers, sharing insights about industrial organization and production efficiency. A few became historians, documenting their experiences for future generations. Weber remained a pilot, flying commercial aircraft in the rebuilding years when Germany was allowed to resume civilian aviation. He never spoke publicly about his wartime service, but he kept his journal, adding to it periodically when memories surfaced or when current events triggered recollections. His children found it after his passing in 1983, a careful documentation of one man's journey from certainty to doubt to understanding. The journal's final entry, written just months before his passing, reflected on that December day in Detroit. He described the shock of recognition, the moment when belief collided with evidence and evidence prevailed. He wrote that every soldier carried assumptions about the conflict, narratives that made sense of sacrifice and hardship. But reality cared nothing for narratives. Reality was assembly lines producing 1,000 engines per day, parking lots filled with worker automobiles, cafeterias serving meat for lunch, while cities across the ocean starved. He had been prepared to see American weakness, had expected confirmation of what he believed. Instead, he had witnessed strength of a type he had not imagined possible, industrial capacity that transformed warfare from a contest of courage and skill into a mathematics problem with a predetermined solution. The experience had changed him fundamentally, replacing ideology with observation, belief with measurement, certainty with humility before evidence. The lesson, he wrote, was not about American superiority or German failure. It was about the dangers of assumptions untested against reality, of narratives maintained despite contrary evidence, of believing what you wished to be true rather than accepting what was demonstrably real. The prisoners who toured River Rouge had received an education in reality, purchased at the price of shattered certainties. It was, he concluded, perhaps the most valuable lesson the conflict had taught him. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.